Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. It's Sunday morning. I'm here with Kim and Zande, and I'm continuing the reading of The Fighter in the Family. So thank you for joining me on this lovely Sunday morning. So let me continue. So I stopped off at chapter 2. So I'm going to continue now at chapter 3, The Fighter in the Family. Chapter 3. St. Anne was a beautiful parish. Everybody said so. To rival the neighboring parishes of Clarendon and St. Catherine in size, and it rivaled Hanover and Portland in rustic beauty. St. Anne was known for its deep red soil, the mineral bauxite, and also for its many rivers and underground caves, and especially its wonderful crop yield. Upon the hills and undulating lowlands were planted acres and acres of pimento, coconuts, bananas, plantains, citrus and coffee, as well as yams, cocoa, sweet potatoes, cassava and tobacco, and spices and seasonings of every description. Whatever you needed to grow, you could plant it in St. Anne. Nathaniel was happy that his father had made a home in this parish, and he was happy that Juju had taken a liking to the soil. The boy was 3 years old and was a big-time planter of crops, and he had a green thumb too. Nathaniel was listening to his transistor radio while working, and one of the government ministers or somebody big like that was complaining that all the young people, the older people too, but the young ones in particular, were deserting the farms in the countryside and were buying a one-way ticket to Kingston. Nathaniel thought of Bruce, who for years had been threatening to go to Kingston to live. Bruce had been to stay with Hilda on several occasions in the past couple of years, and life in the capital city had appealed to him. Kingston moved to Bruce's beat. He was a man of action, he said. He was a man who could easily get used to the quick pulse of Kingston. Bruce was almost 40, but like Hilda, he had just found his age, as they say. Nathaniel thought it was important to let Bruce know what the minister had said. Maybe that would change his mind and make him want to stay. When he saw Bruce at lunchtime, he told him, "Everybody is running away from the farms." Nathaniel said, "The government is concerned. Who is going to plant the yams and the dasheen and the red peas? Who is going to pick the coconuts and the sugar cane and reap the mangoes? Who will feed the nation?" Nathaniel was surprised at his own voice. He thought he sounded somewhat like the minister himself, come to think of it. "They just raising false alarm," Bruce scoffed. "Kingston can't hold everybody. There will come a time when the movements will just have to stop and everybody will come back to the farm." Nathaniel was still worried, though it seemed to him absurd that anyone could prefer hot, sticky, chaotic Kingston over the cool, green, lush knolls of Walker's Wood. He knew that there were people for whom the most important thing in life was the pursuit of money and material luxuries, and for that they were willing to cram themselves into shanty towns, suffer degrading jobs, and get involved in all kinds of nefarious activities. And Bruce showed signs that he was, or at least open to the possibility of becoming, one such person. It made Nathaniel cringe. Who would look after Bruce's cows and goats and chickens and his 3 hogs? Nathaniel had not gone into livestock rearing because he did not like to see the blood dripping from animals when they had to be slaughtered. If there was one thing he had a weak heart for, This was it. It pained his heart too much to see the cows and goats and pigs, who for months had roamed gaily on the meadow greens, strung up with inverted bodies, squealing and mooing and bleating for all they were worth, until at last, after much suffering, their throats were cut and they were left to bleed to death. Moreover, Nathanael could not stomach the smell of the blood, squealing and mooing, or the overwhelming sight of the raw pink flesh. He could not bear seeing chickens running about without their heads, their bodies fluttering for agonizing minutes after their necks were slashed. Then seeing the chickens dipped into boiling hot water and mercilessly plucked. He did not like the way they looked, naked and bumpy. Now, Nathanael was not alone in this repulsion. Hortense shared his views too, for she would not touch a piece of meat that she had witnessed the slaughter of, and she could not bring herself to partake in eating any of Bruce's animals with which she had become familiar, having seen them graze and forage and heard them make sweet noises for months. She would eat the eggs and she would order milk from Bruce, but she had to get her meat from elsewhere, which had been slaughtered and cut up and stored far away out of her view. Bruce could eat any meat at any time, and he even ate some meat that Nathanael would never touch, even if they paid him. For instance, Nathanael did not see the virtue behind eating cow tongue, or cow tripe, or oxtail, or cow head. He had strong opposition to the habit of eating the animal's liver, or pushing the filth out of the intestines, or boiling the animal's head in soup. People had no business eating an animal's tongue, foot, or tail, was his take on the matter. Nathanael did not think that people need to stoop so low. It was absolutely unnecessary. He did not mind relishing a piece of chicken drumstick or breast, or a slice of ham at year end, or some curried goats. Bruce, he had the nasty inclination, as Nathanael saw it, of sucking conch fresh out of shells and eating sardines straight out of the tins without removing the gut, and eating peppered crabs when everybody saw that crabs were full of doo-doo. Nathanael was a planter and nurturer and lover of crops. When they did give out strong smells, the smells were usually lovely and encouraging. No sense trying to hide the fact that you were traveling with a piece of jackfruit, or some East Indian mangoes, or some nesberries or sourshops or guavas. The delicious aromas would give you away. Sometimes you didn't even have to pick the fruits. They fell right smack at your feet. You hardly ever had to search for them long. Their brilliant colors and wonderful smells led you right to them. When he was in the fields and glanced up to survey the rolling bounty, such a pleasure came over him as he could not hope to explain. The sweetness ran deep all the way down to his belly button. The crimson tomatoes, the tender green of okras, and the delicate soursop that you had to cushion like a baby in your arms when it was ripe, lest it be squashed. The hours he would spend tenderly easing out weeds from amongst the peanuts, so he didn't pluck out the peanuts themselves. The hours spent mulching and watering and talking to the plants, as he would talk to Hortens. And when a plant died or suffered disease, or for some reason was not thriving in spite of everything he had tried, Nathanael would guard over that single plant with the same daintiness and patience as he would a preemie in intensive care. When the crops came in during the summertime, or whatever fruit season it was, it made Nathanael know for sure that there must be a God somewhere, doing something right. Who would choose Kingston over this? When he bit into a slice of papaya, what bliss! Wild horses couldn't drive him from Walker's Wood. While he himself had taken mainly to crops, Nathanael knew it was important for livestock farmers to stay on the farms as well. Not only was it their birthright, the proud legacy handed down to them by their fathers and grandfathers, no matter what the level of subsistence, it also contributed to the bread basket so the people could eat. Every mickle make a muckle. You plant this, I plant that, you raise this fowl, I raise this goat, later everybody can have dinner. So Nathanael had been pleased when Bruce, who was his older brother but who had been wilder and more restless in his younger days, announced that he was going to settle into animal rearing and bought himself a good measure of pigs and goats for a start. Then, after some time, he bought cows and more goats and some chickens and hired a fellow to help around the farm. But the boy stole some of the chickens and one of the goats mysteriously could not be found, and people would credit the meat and take ages to pay. Bruce started complaining that he was losing money. But, that aside, Bruce was also very lazy and scornful and didn't clean out the pens as often as was necessary to keep the place smelling decent. And he hated waking up to tie out the goats in the early mornings or having to go back for them in the evenings. He would send his young girls to do it, which was fine, but then he started making them do things that he himself ought to have done. Heavy, dirty, messy work. And it caused quite a row in Bruce's household. And another thing, Bruce was impatient to make a profit. He charged too much for the meat and so ended up losing dedicated customers. Nathanael was just happy that God had given him a boy who had taken a mind to farming, little as he was. This was one boy who would not leave the farm to go to Kingston. Nathanael would see to it. He would try his best to instill in Juju what his father had instilled in him, that the land was precious and ought to be cherished. He would teach Juju how and when and where to plant seeds and how much water each particular seed needed, and how to be patient as the little shoots made their way up towards the sun, so that by the time Juju got to the agricultural college, it was just a matter of filling in the gaps. Nathanael was happy that God had worked it this way. True, there were some setbacks to farming. There were hurricanes for one. A hurricane could cause you to lose everything in one day. But all you had to do was to have the patience and determination and the good sense to start back from scratch. The land was forgiving, and as a matter of fact, the soil was softer and the land richer and the yield always more plentiful in the year following a hurricane. What with all the plants that had been blown down to make natural compost and mulch. There was predial larceny, where boys, and Nathanael suspected some grown men too, would climb over and make away with all sorts of things, from fruits and vegetables to goats to garden hoses to wheelbarrows. They even stole a part of Nathanael's fence one time. Imagine that. But what enterprise did not contain a bit of risk? What industry was without liability? The odd watermelon or pumpkin making its way over the fence was regrettable, but it was part and parcel of the thing called farming. It was manageable, and if it became unmanageable, that still was no reason to give up farming. It was a matter for the authorities to address. Bruce was bent on leaving Walkerswood. One more person off the land won't hurt, he reasoned to Nathaniel. Anyway, I can always come back. It's not like I'm selling the land or anything. Who will look after your animals when you are gone? Nathaniel asked. Bruce said that he might consider selling the animals, but he could always buy back some more animals, if and when he returned. He was going to travel to Kingston and scout about for a place to live, and when he got settled, he would send for Myrtle and the girls. He was going into the capital to try and make a bigger life for them. In fact, if everything went as planned, he would be going next month. I think you should go too, Bruce said to Nathaniel, and Nathaniel laughed loudly. A big holler that rumbled all the way down to the rows of corn way down in the valley. Nathaniel was a man who thought things out clearly and carefully before implementing them. So once he had made up his mind about something, he didn't take kindly to people coming around trying to change his mind, and he accorded them that same respect. So, seeing that Bruce had made up his mind about leaving Walkerswood for Kingston, crazy and regrettable as it was, Nathaniel let the argument rest at that. Moreover, he knew that Bruce was short-tempered, and he knew that he too was short-tempered. And as he had a wife and a young farmer who was depending on him, he did not want to cause a row that might leave Bruce in the hospital clinging for life, and him, Nathaniel, rotting in jail. Such a row had happened already about 10 years ago, and they both missed the above consequences by their teeth. Hortens was now 6 months pregnant with her second child, and Juju loved to rest his head on his mother's belly. He could feel tiny little movements, which Hortens said was a baby growing inside there, but Juju wasn't sure. It felt more to him like a watermelon that had gone a bit soft, and he had been calling the belly soft melon for about a month. He would cuddle up beside his mother and say, "Let me feel the soft melon, Ganga." For some unknown reason, he had taken to calling his mother Ganga. For his protection, they had built a bigger, more solid gate by the front entrance to the property, which led out directly to the highway. Well, honestly, it wasn't technically a highway in the strict sense of the word, but people called it a highway, and they drove on it as if it were a highway. At any rate, it was a mighty busy road, and Juju was a curious, eager, active boy who had a history of wandering off. When he was only 2 years old, his father had taken Juju with him about 3 miles across the commons to visit an old friend, Mas Black, and to give the man some coconuts. He had kept Juju very close to him, and they were discussing the strange habits of peanuts along the way, how the plant grew upward at first and then dug itself back down into the soil where the peanut shells grew underground. They spent some time with the gentleman, and then they went home. The next day at about noon, when they were calling Juju for lunch and realized that he did not respond, for he was a child who loved his food, the alarm was made that the boy was missing. A search was launched immediately, and when the men and women in the village did not find Juju anywhere, and the children had looked all over his favorite hiding places, the police were called in, and there was widespread panic. The district constable told Nathaniel he should consider the possibility that the little fellow may have been kidnapped. Kidnapped? Nathaniel asked, perplexed. Why would anybody want to kidnap Nathaniel Jr.? He's only a boy of 2. That's the age they like to kidnap them, the DC said with an air of wisdom. He implored Nathaniel to come at once to the community center after changing his dirty clothes, for he had been digging for yams, where an emergency meeting had been organized. Perhaps if you made an appeal, they would return the child, the DC advised. Everyone gathered in the community center. Hortens was in the throes of depression and great bawling. Nathaniel sat on the chair up front, and there were about 80 people in the audience who had dropped everything to help find Juju. What were the chances that the kidnapper would have been there in the audience? No one could calculate, but it was worth a shot. The DC instructed Nathaniel to make a solemn and humble plea, with a few tears if possible, to soften the perpetrator's heart and make him return Juju at once. Nathaniel did not know anything about solemn, humble pleas. He grabbed his cutlass and raised it in the air, and stood up and said with a mean face, "Bring back my boy or else." The DC told Nathaniel to wait at home because he was not handling the matter diplomatically. But at 3 o'clock that day, to everybody's relief, Juju could be seen making his way across the commons, holding Mass Black's hand. "He brought 2 green bananas for me," Mass Black told everyone. "I was at home and I saw him coming. I couldn't believe he was alone." Juju, with his kind-hearted self, had taken up the 2 bananas and had brought them to the place where his father had taken him the day before, 3 miles away, and not exactly as the crow flew, to share his bounty. A true farmer at heart. How he had found his way, and so quickly, no one knew. Nathaniel took the boy in his arms and nearly cried, but he was extremely happy and proud. Hortense was beside herself with relief, and would not let Juju out of her sight for the rest of that day. Nathaniel internalized the experience as a sign from God that yes, the boy was gifted. It was touching to observe such generosity of spirit, such self-sacrifice, virtues rare in one so young. And don't forget, the boy must have had some exceptional navigational skills and a sharp sense of direction, to have made his way across a path that he had only traversed once, through bushes and across a little brook. And he had chosen 2 very good bananas too, Mass Black had said. All these talents ought to come in handy in time, when Juju was out and about, driving tractors and harvesting crops, Nathaniel reflected. But they scolded Juju nonetheless, and gave him strict warning not to leave the property alone. The youngster was cherished, but his father had no intention of spoiling it, in spite of the fact that he was so gifted. There was ample space for Juju to run and frolic. Now that he was older, he was included in the games of the other children. He loved to hide under the cellar, and everyone knew that was the place he always went during hide and seek. Though they always found him promptly, Juju was too small to realize that he needed a new hiding place. Oh Lord. Inside at night, when he wasn't kneading his little hands into the soft melon, or reading from his infant spelling book, he was in his father's lap, talking about guavas, how they were always full of worms, but so delicious. Juju loved to sit by his gangang's feet while she embroidered doilies with garlands of fruits or flowers. And he would point out each one and tell her the names and try to spell them. It was August and the guineas were hanging down from trees, and the children were sucking off the wonderful, tangy flesh and seeing who could spit the seeds furthest. Juju wanted guineas. He had never tasted them, for everyone knew that guineas were dangerous for small children. They were so round and slimy that they could easily get lodged in the throat. Gang, I want guineas, please, Juju said, and his mother told him no, not yet, when he was a bit bigger. Give the boy the guinea, Hortens, Nathaniel said. Can't you see, Juju is different from other small children? Nathaniel handed Juju a guinea, and Juju bit into the green skin and peeled the guinea like an expert. He ran to his mother with delight. Look, Gang, a twinnie. He had heard the other children say that when they grew like that, with one guinea having seeds that bulge out into two halves, you call them twinnies. Hortense smiled, but she was still fearful. Crack it up for him, Natty, she said. Her hands were soapy, for she had been washing. No need to crack it, Nathaniel said. You try to shield him too much, Hortense. You have to let the boy grow rough. Juju scampered off, sucking his guinea. What Hortense remembered about that day was how frisky and smiling and handsome her little son was. She blocked out every other memory from her mind, but Nathaniel remembered, in every striking detail, how the boy had run back over to them, gripping his little throat and trying to talk, trying to tell them that the guinea was stuck, trying to beg them please to get it out quick. But he couldn't talk, and he couldn't breathe, and it was only a matter of seconds before he fell to the ground. Nathaniel remembered, as if he could still hear her voice like a loudspeaker, Hortense screaming, knock his back, turn him upside down and knock his back. And he remembered the other children screaming and running in every direction, as Hortense was telling each of them, run, tell Bruce come quick with the van. Run, call Nurse Smith and tell her run come quick. Clear the way and make him get to breathe. Lord Jesus. And at the same time, she was bending down beside him, trying to force her finger into Juju's throat to get out the guinea. And Nathaniel remembered vividly the shock and the pain and the remorse of the villagers who had gathered so fast from out of nowhere. He remembered them turning away sharply and kneeling down and crying, and he remembered them screaming very mournfully, Juju dead, whoa, poor Juju dead. Poor Juju is dead. Poor Juju is dead. Did you see that coming? Poor Juju is dead. Oh my God. That's the end of chapter 3. Alright, join me in the next video for chapter 4. The baby just died, guys. The baby just died.